don't you all come on back in? We are, I know we're all very excited to see each other in person again. That's why we took perhaps a bit longer of a coffee break than was expected, but I know we would all like to continue drinking coffee and talking because it's good to finally see each other face to face. But let's get started on this on the second panel discussion. So I'm John Seaman. I'm a research fellow here in the Center for Asian Studies. I'll be moderating this session. What we're going to do now is shift from a broad discussion on the impacts of the war, ongoing war in Ukraine, on East Asia, and try to delve a bit more deeply into the questions of the risk of high-intensity conflict emerging or breaking out in East Asia, and we'll do that in two parts. We'll focus first part on Taiwan, which is what we will do here right now, and then this afternoon after lunch we will focus on the Korean Peninsula. And so it is my great pleasure to welcome an excellent panel of experts and also politician as well, joining us from Taipei. We're going to look at the impact of the war in Ukraine on the potential for conflict in the Strait of Taiwan, and to do that, I think we'll start off first with a point of view from Taiwan, and we're very honored to be joined by Dr. Luo Zhizheng, who is both a politician and a scholar, if I may say so. He is a representative in the legislative Yuan. On one hand, he's a representative of the 7th Electoral District of New Taipei City since 2016, and he also sits on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, so he has a role as a politician, but he is also a scholar in that he obtained a PhD from UC Berkeley in the United States, but he is also a professor at Soochow University, where he has also been the head of the political science department. So he is both a politician and a scholar. He will provide us some views, some lessons learned from Taiwan, some of the reflecting in Taiwan. He's also a very high-ranking member of the Democratic Progressive Party, and so he's also going to provide us a point of view of the party in power in that sense. And so we were very happy to have a discussion with you. Then we will turn to my colleague, Marc Julienne. Marc, we've had plenty of chances to talk about this between the two of us, so I'm very happy that finally we're going to get you on the panel here, and so that we can put your ideas out here in public. And so you'll be speaking to us mostly about how you analyze China's perspective and how what the lessons that China is learning from the war in Ukraine, put that in a broader perspective of Chinese strategy and thinking with regards to Taiwan and the Taiwan question. And so we'll be very happy to hear from you on that. And so, of course, I imagine that you all know Marc very well. If you're here at Ifri then, and you're tuning in, then you probably know Marc very well. And so thank you also for stepping up and joining us on the panel. And last but certainly not least, Simona GRANO will then follow on with a view of from Europe in particular, how Europe is positioning itself on this question, and in particular take a very specific look at the case of Switzerland. So Simona is a senior lecturer at the University of Zurich. She's also the director of the Taiwan Studies Project at the University of Zurich, and so she's very well placed to talk about these questions. She's had a number of different roles at different universities here in Europe, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and also deals in questions of social and political transformation in Taiwan and Taiwanese identity politics. So we'll also get into that dimension. You're not only asked to speak about Europe, but I'll ask you lots of questions about Taiwanese domestic situation as well. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Dr. Luo. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you for your patience while we all enjoyed a bit of coffee. But I will hand you the floor for 10 minutes or so. Why don't you give us a view of how things stand from Taiwan, please.
I want to start by thanking the Ifri for inviting me to join this very distinguished panelists and audience. I think the topic for this section is about the impact of the war on the region and also the implications for the Taiwan Strait. But I have to start by saying that there are no winners in wars. So the thing is, what could we have done to prevent the war from happening in Europe and also probably in Asia in the future? So it depends on what kind of lessons we learn from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But obviously, it's very important to know that what happens in Europe has made something that unthinkable thinkable. I think before the war happened in Europe, I think a lot of people, or the majority of people in Europe, would say that it's hard to imagine that there could be a war in Eastern Europe or in Europe in general. So anything is possible. So never say never. So same thing can be said about the region. That is, it's very difficult to imagine that could be a war in the Taiwan Strait in the past, or even a war in the Pacific in general. But I think that kind of possibility cannot be ruled out. So it's a possible situation that there could be a military conflict in Eastern Europe or in Eastern Asia or in the Pacific in general. Secondly, I think this war has made China and Russia closer and closer, militarily, economically, and politically. So this carries a very important impact or implication for the regional countries in the Indo-Pacific, also for other parts of the world as well. So what are the implications of this kind of closer ties between Russia and China for the security and political situation in every part of the world? Thirdly, I think this will also teach us a story about what kind of military affairs we are having in this modern world. In other words, we have this kind of revolution or innovation in military affairs. We are a new type of warfare. And when we talk about security, especially military cooperation among countries, there could be all types, all forms of security cooperations, not just sending arms, not just sending troops to help the allies. Intelligence sharing, information sharing, or cyber cooperation. These are new types of cooperation that we are having. So this will also teach us a very important lesson about new type of military affairs. And that, could be lessons could be drawn by China, by Taiwan, by all the countries. But we are hopeful that we can learn right lessons. But some countries learn mistakenly from the war in Europe, in Eastern Europe. And I think at the end, we have to understand what is the nature of the conflicts or military conflicts that happened in Europe. To me, same type of conflict could happen in the region because it all has to do with the nature of the conflicts we are having right now. That is, it's a war or conflict between autocracy and democracy. And when you have this kind of war between or conflict between autocracy and democracy, it's a challenge or it's a threat to the different ways of life between two countries. And that is very important because that is the conflict we are having right now in Taiwan Strait. So what led to the conflict or the war in Eastern Europe and possibly in East Asia? I always believe that there are three possible sources of military conflicts or even war in the Taiwan Strait. One is that authoritarian leaders feel so confident that they can win a war quickly or they can win a war overnight. So overconfidence on the part of authoritarian leaders could lead to a military conflict unwanted by other countries as well. So this kind of overconfidence happened before the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin may have believed that he could have won the war very quickly, so they can get in and get out very easily. That's one of the reasons why he strike and attack Ukraine. If he had expected a attrition war, maybe he would have think twice about invading Ukraine. So one possible source that could lead to a military conflict in the region in the Taiwan Strait is that probably Xi Jinping or the leadership in general believes that they could win a quick war in the Taiwan Strait for whatever reason. For instance, if they believe that the military balance has been vastly tilted in the favor of the PRC, or the military imbalance in the Taiwan Strait favor the PRC, so they can win a quick war, then that kind of a calculation could lead to the leaders in Beijing to believe that it's okay to win a war because it's going to be very quick. Or if leaders in Beijing believe that no country will come to the assistance of Taiwan because those countries are afraid of engaging in a war with a country having nuclear powers. So that's also one of the reasons that leaders in Beijing would believe that nobody will be coming to the assistance of Taiwan, so they can take over Taiwan very easily. So the overconfidence on the part of authoritarian leaders, is, I believe, one of the possible sources of military tension or even conflict in the Taiwan region. The second reason or second sources of military tension or conflict in the region is the sense or the feeling of insecurity on the part of the authoritarian country or the leaders. And I think one of the reasons or one of the explanations for the war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that some people believe that President Putin or Russia believe that the so-called NATO expansion has jeopardized the security of Russia. So Russia had to respond by invading Ukraine. So that kind of insecurity or sense of insecurity led to the leaders in the Kremlin that they had to react, or they had to preempt or prevent that kind of a dangerous situation for Russia or even for leaders in Beijing. That's one possible reason for that kind of insecurity. But I think another possible reason for the sense of insecurity that could happen in China is domestic instability inside China. Because look at what happened in China's PRC's history. Whenever China faced domestic problems, they would try to use this kind of conflicts with their neighboring countries to divert domestic discontent, to vent this kind of domestic or internal anger. So nationalism is one of the reasons that leaders in Beijing have to face. Now, China is creating a vicious cycle by itself. On the one hand, they vent, they create, they hype this kind of nationalism within China. So when something happened outside China or inside China, this kind of rising nationalism will force the leaders in Beijing to take action outward in order to divert this kind of domestic discontent. So we do have concerns about domestic instability within China, and we are concerned about economic chaos or social chaos that could force the leaders in Beijing to find scapegoat. And Taiwan will try our best not to become a scapegoat to give China any excuse or pretext to launch a war against Taiwan. But that's something that beyond our control, because what happens within China are China's own internal problems. But we have to pay great attention to this kind of great, discontent that could be rising that China has to deal with. So that's the second reason that I believe that leaders in Beijing could, to take military actions against Taiwan. The third possible source for military conflicts or war in the Taiwan Strait is miscalculation, misunderstanding, or miscommunication. And that could happen especially when there is no direct line of communication between the two sides or between all relevant parties. And what makes me more concerned about is the recent military activities of the PLA in the surrounding areas in Taiwan Strait areas. because that could lead to miscalculation, misunderstanding, or unwanted conflicts between the two sides. Look at what happened in year 2000 when U.S. reconnaissance planes had a military had a crash with China's fighter jets, and that could lead to a very tense situation between the U.S. and China. But at that time, the U.S. and China still had this kind of direct communication. They have hotline and so on. But if something happened between Taiwan and China now cut off all the communication lines between Taiwan and China, I mean hotlines. So if accidental conflicts happened, we have concerns about a very quick escalation of a military, large-scale military conflicts between the two sides. So the intensity or extensity of China's military activities in the region increase the possibility of this kind of accidental conflicts. And this is one of the reasons that we have concern about the so-called gray zone tactics on the part of China. And China has now has become more subtle and sophisticated in launching this kind of gray zone tactics against Taiwan. The recent example is the drones from China flying to the offshore islands of Taiwan. And I have to say that we have to react because for us, having their drones fly over above our military bases is very provocative. And China said these are civilian drones. Well, we don't know. And, we have to make sure that even civilian drones cannot fly to our, above our military units, bases. So we have to react. So Taiwan decided to change our SOP. We shut it down. We shut it down. But the thing is, that could happen once, twice. If China fly 10,000 drones, 10 drones, 100 drones to our offshore islands, what should we do? And China can continue to claim that these are civilian drones. What could happen? Also, the recent example of live fire drills, missile tests, missile, launching in the territorial waters close to Taiwan. Well, do we consider this kind of live fire missile exercises quasi blockade of Taiwan, virtual blockade of Taiwan, or just drills, or China is simulating this kind of blockade of Taiwan by launching these kind of missiles close and closer to Taiwan? Do we consider provocation? Do we consider war or gray zone? And China has been pushing the envelope by crossing the so-called median line in the Taiwan Strait. So many countries, including the US or even some European countries, they say that we oppose any unilateral change of the status quo. But the thing is, it's not just intent to change the status quo. China is changing the status quo unilaterally. China has changed the status quo unilaterally. So we should deliver deeds. We should deliver our words with deeds. So we say that we oppose any unilateral change of the status quo to the status quo. So what's our response? Because China has already changed the status quo. So these are the challenges we are facing. Gray zone tactics, China's incremental approach of annexing Taiwan, and China is, has domestic as well as external problems and so on. Finally, let me say, China's approach to change the status quo is a reflection of its strategic goal to become a maritime power. It's China's grand strategy to make China a maritime power. For the long history of 1,000 years, China had been a continental power. But China decided to become a maritime power. And Taiwan is not just an issue of nationalism. China say that Taiwan is a nationalistic issue. I think that's just an excuse. That's a pretext. Taiwan is more than that. For China, Taiwan is a strategic issue. China stands in the way of China becoming a maritime power. But when China say that Taiwan is an issue of nationalism, because that's one way to deter other countries from getting involved in China's quote-unquote internal issues. So that's the argument I want to make today, because the threat we are facing is real, and I have to say it's also imminent, and China is taking military actions in a very subtle and sophisticated way. But so far, our response has been very limited, and I have to say it has been very limited, too little, and sometimes too late. So let me stop here and welcome your comments and questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Luo. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I would actually like to come back and ask you questions right away, but I think I'll hold on to them. But this raises a lot of thoughts for me about what your framing of the three sources of conflict are and what sort of policy prescriptions that might lead to. So that might be something that you want to think about, and I'll come back to you on that. In particular, on the second point you said about feeling of insecurity and authoritarian leaders, and your second sub-point within that about domestic instability and nationalism. Marc, I'm going to turn to you to talk a bit about China. And one question that's always sort of in debate here is the degree to which domestic instability leads to foreign policy aggressiveness. And there's been some work recently by Jessica Chen Weiss, and this sort of based on work done by Andrew Chubb, for instance, who sort of take an opposite line, who say that in fact, in many instances, China, when there is faced with domestic instability, will actually be more restrained on the international scene. So it's a debate that we can have, and perhaps we want to enter into that. And I think, Marc, you might also have a lot to say on that. So this is a good point to transition to you, and also on this question of China's strategic goals. So Marc, I will hand you the floor for 10 minutes to illuminate us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. I will sure follow up on this specific point. Before sharing some ideas, I would like also to take a second to thank you, because John is the architect of this terrific conference, and you do the amazing job. And also Constantine, which assistant was, I think, really important. In order to assess the impact of the war in Ukraine on the PRC's intentions to take over Taiwan in the short or longer term, I will first remind what was the context in the Taiwan Strait before the Russian invasion. It is indeed important to remember that since the election of President Tsai Ing-wen from the Democratic Progressive Party in January 2016 in Taiwan, Beijing took a much tougher stance on Taiwan and cut off dialogue. Since the beginning of his second term in 2017, Secretary General Xi Jinping in the PRC progressively increased political, economic, and military pressure on Taiwan. A new level was reached in 2020. First, President Tsai has been elected for a second term in Taiwan with a large majority. And second, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan was praised for its health crisis management and supported by many countries to reintegrate the World Health Organization, from which it was kicked out in 2016. In September 2020, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, started what it calls routine air exercises, consisting in sending aircraft beyond the median line in the south of the Taiwan Strait. Those have become daily exercises, and PLA aircraft are now flying as far as the southeast of the island in the Pacific Ocean, and also since this August in the middle of the Taiwan Strait. And so the PRC is pretending those kind of operations, especially until the southeast of Taiwan, are presented by the PRC as to prove that it has now the capability to encircling the island and establishing a no-fly zone over Taiwan, which is perhaps a very disputable statement, by the way, but this is the official narrative in China. So since 2020, then, military harassment is permanent and increasing, which already clearly indicating Beijing's goal to unify, as I said, Taiwan, most likely by force. The only question at that time was when. So even before the Ukraine, the tensions in the Strait and the risk of a high-intensity crisis was already high. Now, I come to the central question, how the war in Ukraine impacted Beijing's plans towards Taiwan. So Beijing seems to have thought that Putin would win the war within a few days or week, but Ukraine obviously resisted, partly thanks to the military support of the West indeed, but without any foreign direct intervention on the ground. Putin's difficulty in Ukraine must have triggered a reassessment of Beijing strategic calculus regarding the unification of Taiwan by force. And this reassessment would likely be in favor of more caution from Beijing. Indeed, in the Taiwan's case, there are two major differences from Ukraine. First, it is a mountainous island, even more difficult to seize than the flat Ukraine. Second, since the US and NATO clearly stated that they would not intervene on the ground, no such statement have been made for Taiwan, quite the contrary actually, because President Biden stated on several occasions that the US would intervene to defend Taiwan. The first 3 times he said that, there were controversies on how serious he was or how aware he was of the impact of such declarations. And at each time, the White House affirmed that there was no change in the US policy towards Taiwan. Anyway, the last time he made such a statement was 3 days ago. And now it is quite hard to believe that this is something else than an actual policy statement. So it is reasonable to think that the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is lower since the beginning of the war in Ukraine than it was before, because Beijing most certainly has learned the lesson from Ukraine. Even lower, the risk still exists, however, and it is difficult to probably assess it today. There is one very broad consensus within the strategic communities in Europe, in the US and in Asia. This consensus relates to the assessment of the PRC's military capabilities. Most military experts, including the US DoD and the Taiwan Ministry of Defense, assess that the PRC will not have the full military capability required to launch such an arduous military operation as the invasion of Taiwan before at least 2027. Indeed, China still lacks logistic capabilities like replenishment ships, air tankers, as well as anti-submarine warfare capabilities, and also combat-proven soldiers and officers. Given the PLA's rapid expansion, China will likely have filled those gaps by 2027 and could then get serious about an attack. I have to remind that 2027 is already a very near term, by the way. But I would like also to challenge this consensus and consider the risk of a crisis in an even nearer term. To do this, I suggest to considering 3 open questions that I think that are overlooked, and we could also discuss that in the discussion. So first, what does Xi Jinping think of its own military capability compared to China? And this is also related with what Dr. Lo said about overconfidence. China actually sees Russia with more and more condescension. So in Xi Jinping's eyes, if Russian army gets stuck in Ukraine, this would not necessarily mean that China would have the same fate with Taiwan. China's displays of self-confidence and assertiveness or overconfidence for the past few years should raise question on how powerful they really think they are. Second, there is a question of when China will be ready. But for Chinese strategists, the question is also when will the adversaries will be ready too. I think it's wise to assess China's potential offensives on Taiwan as a cost-benefit calculus and a window of opportunity. My point is that the longer China waits, the better its military become, but also the better prepared will be its adversaries. And third, this window of opportunity, according to this cost-benefit calculus, may be closer than we think, especially if we take into account Chinese domestic policy. And once again, I would converge with what Dr. Loh said. The next 5 years in China are going to be very challenging for Xi Jinping when it comes to economic prosperity, social stability, and also political stability. If we agree on this point, we may consider that the CPC, the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping himself may find themselves in a more difficult political situation after 2028, with a stronger army for sure, but with less political leverage perhaps. And in this scenario, Beijing may want to rush its unification plans. So I will stop here, and I think we could further the discussion during the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Marc. It's also very thought-provoking. So I'd love to follow up straight on that. But I think that's a little bit alarming, I guess. Your last 3 points, and maybe we can turn for a view to Simona to think about what Europe might do, what Europe is doing, how Europe is reacting to this situation. And so you'll take a broad view of Europe, I guess, and then focus in on one particular case of Switzerland in particular, which you know quite well. So why don't you follow us up on this before I start asking all of my tough questions? Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation, as all the others have said. And yes, I will be focusing on the changed attitudes in Europe, and especially I have taken as an example Switzerland towards Taiwan in the past, let's say, 2 to 3 years since starting from the corona pandemic. Many of you may wonder why Switzerland as a European example could be a bit of a weird choice. On the other hand, even though Switzerland is, for obvious reasons, not part of the EU and has had quite a few problems in the past few years in renovating its own agreements with the EU, nevertheless, I think foreign policy precisely shows us that Switzerland cannot escape this relationship with the EU and also with the United States. And I won't probably go into all of the foreign policy cascades document that have been implemented in Switzerland the past 2 to 3 years, but there's been quite a few, one of them specifically on China only. And when you take a look at these documents, actually all of them are really focused also on the issues of how to preserve our economic interests, but at the same time, of course, increase our relationship with like-minded countries, such as, for example, Taiwan, but in this case, mostly the European Union and America. So the China-US competition is very much in this equation, right? So what I will do in the first part of my brief presentation is try to talk about Europeans' changed engagements towards Taiwan. And in the second part, as I said, I will talk about Switzerland, right? So first of all, we have already said that Taiwan is particularly important because of a variety of reasons, including, of course, its importance in the supply chain. It is a vital hub, of course, for technological manufacturing of semiconductors and so on and so forth. And, of course, because of its strategic location, it's, in a certain extent, and I mean no disrespect here, but much more important geographically speaking, strategically speaking, than the Ukraine, right? But what I think is important here is that there is another aspect which goes beyond economic ties. We hear a lot in the words of policymakers lately, and that is that Taiwan is actually a like-minded partner that shares our values. And you hear this more and more even last week. I will address that in a second at the level of the European Union, right? So, and what I started to ask myself when I was preparing this presentation according to your instructions is, actually Taiwan has long possessed a positive story. I mean, Taiwan has had one of the longest standing martial law regime, but after that, when it lifted martial law in '87, It has become peacefully and almost without bloodshed, a democracy. So why is this shift taking place now, right? Since Taiwan has possessed these positive attributes as a democracy since at least 87 or early 1990s, when it first liberalized and then democratized. Well, I do believe that it is often, I should say, geopolitical domains that amplifies Taiwan capacity for being heard. And I'm going to name three of those. First of all, of course, the corona pandemic, when, of course, distrust and disquiet vis-a-vis China was sort of intensifying across the globe. And of course, many more countries in Europe and all over, of course, came to see Taiwan as a more trustworthy and reliable partner in, as I said, supply chains, semiconductors, data protection, and overall, what I mentioned before, really a like-minded partner in terms of both economic and political cooperation. And of course, at the same time, across Europe, there is this sort of like awareness of how, due to extended disruptions of PRC supply chains, still now for COVID-19 lockdowns, the PRC clout, economic clout, is also partially diminishing. And this is a discussion that we see in Switzerland going on quite a lot, right? Then the second point, the second geopolitical shift is, I believe, it's Taiwan's increasing diplomatic and economic isolation, right? And as Marc said before, starting, of course, with 2016 and the Simona administration, and how China reacted to her election. So this initial shift in perceptions, and I say this starting from the COVID pandemic, I think that many European countries also had the possibility of taking a look at how well Taiwan managed the pandemic without employing draconian measures. And that has had a huge impact because, of course, especially in Switzerland, where the WHO is located, a lot of people started to discuss why can't Taiwan share its positive experience with the rest of the world through the proper official channels, right? And that has made an impact also on the layperson, not just on politicians. So this, I would say, this sparked a secondary reaction to Taiwan's increased diplomatic and also economic isolation by China in the international realm by many countries, which of course has been brought about by the PRC. And after the pandemic and again the Russian invasion of Ukraine is now leading to a pushback from many European countries, at least so far rhetorically, and also, of course, from Taipei itself. And then the third point, the third shift, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when, of course, we know that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has forced the European Union and many other, of course, countries, but especially its member nations, to take, or I would say, to drastically reevaluate the costs of trade with Russia. And of course, with Xi Jinping binding himself to Putin and China sort of like echoing Russian propaganda, this reevaluation is now also being extended to other autocracies in general, and more specifically, of course, to the PRC. Right, so in this final part of my presentation, I'd like to focus on what does that mean concretely for European countries, and especially for countries like Switzerland. Now, Switzerland is interesting because, of course, it has a neutrality policy, and we know of other European countries that have started to debate their neutrality policies, like Finland and Sweden, but you can imagine Switzerland is in a very different geographical situation. That plays a lot of role in this because we feel protected by our neighboring countries, and also we don't share a border with Russia. Nevertheless, a lot of discussion are going on. So let me briefly address the European-Taiwan relationship in a nutshell, and I think we have more time after for the Q&A because I don't have time to go into all of it. But of course, what we have seen at the European level happening is that the European Parliament, in a diplomatic and economic offensive, is really trying to put up a comprehensive plan to sort of like boost Taiwan's economic resilience and international recognition, right? And especially, of course, we have had official visits being increased, even before Nancy Pelosi, which of course was not by Europe, but by the US, but even before that, there was a lot of talk about that. And last November, actually, there were members of the European Parliament Special Committee, I think, on foreign interference that went to Taiwan, talked to Tsai Ing-wen, discussed joint strategies to counter disinformation, but they represented themselves in their individual capacity and not the EU Parliament, right? So if I had to add a fourth dimension, which I didn't talk about before, this would be the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan, which has once again even reinvigorated such talks. But we know, of course, that last week, first of all, the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed the Taiwan's Policy Act, right? And I think about a few hours or one day later, the same thing, of course, the European Union Parliament also passed this resolution on September 15, which condemned China's military aggression against Taiwan and, of course, stated that probably, or not probably, but for China's provocative actions with the Nancy Pelosi, after the Nancy Pelosi visit, China should actually, this should have consequences for China's very own relationship with the EU, right? Let me briefly address, I think there's a lot more to say about Europe, of course, but we can do that later. But very briefly, let me address Switzerland's positions towards Taiwan. And I'm just going to say that Switzerland's position towards Taiwan is very much filtered by Switzerland's own position vis-à-vis China, as you can imagine. So first of all, Switzerland has a series of firsts when it comes to the PRC. We were, I think, the first continental Europe country to recognize the PRC in 1950. Right? That was very early. Most of the countries did it in the 70s. Second, and this is the main point, in 2014, Switzerland actually was the first country in continental Europe to actually have a free trade agreement in place with the PRC. It then joined also in 2016 the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then signed a memorandum of understanding on finance and trade with China in 2019. And especially the free trade agreement, which has now been put on stall by China, because they felt that Switzerland criticized too harshly China's human rights violation, actually would cost a lot of billions to Switzerland if we were to be exposed, for example, to the same treatment that Lithuania got last year when it decided to actually allow Taiwan to establish a representative office there with the name Taiwan rather than the usual formula like Taipei Délégation Culturelle et Économique, right? So, of course, nevertheless, as I said, this is the filtering, right, of the Taiwan-Switzerland relationship, because we always keep in mind that because of this free trade agreement, we are now subjected to economic coercion by China, potentially. And this makes the government act very cautiously. I'm coming to my conclusion. So Switzerland's positions towards Taiwan, as I said, of course, it is that Switzerland does not maintain any official relations with Taiwan out of deference to the Federal Council One China policy. But nevertheless, Taiwan is a significant trading partner for Switzerland. It is actually the 5th most important market in Asia. And the parliament, especially in the past year or two, and even more after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, is actually increasingly more pro-Taiwan. So actually I would say that in the parliament at least, not at the level of the Federal Council, but in the parliament, pro-Taiwan voices actually dominate. And they have been presenting several motions. First of all, to establish a free trade agreement with Taiwan. This has been turned down before by the Federal Council. Now they're trying to push it back on the agenda. Then a second one that has been promoted really, or pushed, it's a motion that has been pushed in June, right before what happened in August with Nancy Pelosi, was calling for Taiwan to become a main hub in the global Swiss research network, aimed at consolidating basically and deepening already existing relationship with Taiwan in the field of science, technology, innovation, and culture. And here again, I have to say the Federal Council recommended just 2 weeks ago not to pursue this, because they think that we already have enough similar agreements with Taiwan, and that no one would profit out of it, because we already have existing frameworks in place that allow for this kind of cooperation. But in addition, the Federal Council is actually preparing a report on Taiwan under pressure from the Parliament, which should be finished in 2023. So my point is, and then we can come to a very interesting, hopefully, discussion, is that even though there are pro-Taiwan voices in the parliament in Switzerland, this does not mean that all these moves and pushes for closer relationship between Switzerland and Taiwan will actually go through. But nevertheless, it does show that these are direct consequences of the mutated geopolitical environment, with an increasing number of European actors that are really started to embrace the idea of broadening their ties with Taiwan and expand on already existing economic and cultural ties with the island since the corona pandemic, and then later on with the 2 other shifts. And I should say that even at the level of the Swiss government, next week there will be a meeting with experts on Taiwan to look into the possibility of what to do with sanctions, and be prepared in case, of course, something that is unthinkable and we hope will never happen will happen. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Simona. I think that's the case of Switzerland isn't one that we would immediately jump to, but it's one that's actually quite interesting, particularly given the historic neutrality stance of Switzerland. So that's thanks for bringing those ideas to the table. We've got about 35 minutes here for exchanges. I don't want to monopolize the floor necessarily, so I'll throw out some very quickly, but then I'll turn to you here in the audience, and also those of you who are joining us online. The first question is in some ways really sort of a reaction to what Marc has laid out in terms of the timeline, and I'm asking this to you, Dr. Luo, but perhaps also to you, Simona, who has a very good understanding of domestic situation within Taiwan. Taiwan was the Taiwan Strait. Some international media has billed the Taiwan Strait to be the most dangerous place on earth, and that really gives the sense of impending doom in a way. And so I guess I would like to get your sense, Dr. Luo, of the sense of immediacy, of a potential or immediacy or imminence of a potential conflict with Taiwan, and how that plays out in everyday life in Taiwan, and how you experience that. And in sort of a broader question on that is, and I think Simona, you'll be able to come in on this, is the Taiwanese self-perception and national identity question. And I think we have a fairly quick response to that here, and we say, we see Taiwanese national identity shifting, and Taiwan is starting to have its own identity as Taiwanese people feel more Taiwanese and much less attached to China. And the driving factors behind that, we tend to say, are China's policy in Hong Kong, repressive Chinese regime, this sort of thing. Is it a more complex picture than that? So we've got the shifting self-perception of Taiwan among the Taiwanese people. What are the drivers behind that? Is it only based on relationship to the PRC, or is there something deeper going on here? So to talk a bit about how Taiwanese people see themselves, and then Marc, I'd like to ask you specifically a question about this. One of the 3 points that you made about things that are overlooked is this notion that the longer China waits, the stronger its adversaries become. And we've heard from a number of Chinese academics that in fact, the consensus in Beijing might be that the U.S. is on a declining path, a long-term decline. And so that sort of your point counters some of that analysis. So I'd like you to go perhaps a little bit deeper to think about this idea that you've said that actually China's adversaries are becoming stronger the longer China waits, and that pushes China to need to move faster, and increases this imminency question, this immediacy about it. So I'll let the three of you have some quick responses, and then I'll turn to the room. So, Dr. Luo, go ahead.
I think there's a growing awareness of the military tension in the Taiwan Strait, but I don't think the majority of people feel that the war is imminent, or there's a timetable for China to attack Taiwan. Okay, so the move here is that yes, there's an increase in tension, and China has increased and intensified its military activities in the region, but I don't think there's the sense that the war is imminent. Okay, that's why everybody's life is as normal as possible. But again, it's a very difficult balancing act for the government. Because on one hand, I want to make sure that people realize that the threat is real, that we have to prepare ourselves for that. But on the other hand, we don't want to scare the people, because that's one of the purpose of China's military activities, to intimidate the people in Taiwan, to influence our stock market, to influence the people's attitudes towards China, and so on. So again, we want to make people realize that the threat is real, but we don't want to scare the people. So it's a very difficult balancing act on the part of the government. Okay. And secondly, as you said, there's a growing Taiwanese identity. Okay. And I always believe that this kind of growing Taiwanese identity is a function of China's policy towards Taiwan. The more military or hostilities from China to Taiwan, the more likely that people in Taiwan will feel that they are Taiwanese, because it's we and versus they, enemy versus allies and friends. I think, for instance, there have been a surveys conducted by the local media here, asking your view, people's views about the neighboring countries, and which country do you believe is the most friendly country to Taiwan. The majority of people in Taiwan tend to respond by saying that Japanese is the most friendly country to Taiwan. Next, and then the next is Americans, and then the Chinese. So, China's heavy-handed approach in Taiwan towards Taiwan has been driving Taiwan away from China. But that put the close tribulation in a very difficult situation. That is, China is very concerned about Taiwan drifting away. So they had to use this kind of heavy-handed approach. But when China, displays this kind of military posture against Taiwan, people feel that they are alienated by China. So it's a vicious cycle. So we do have concern about if that continues to happen, and the leaders in Beijing, if they believe that, there's no choice but to use the force against Taiwan, and when we will come to that point. But the thing is, I don't think that there's a timetable for leaders in China for that kind of use of force, or to bring Taiwan back to China's motherland with use of force. So far, I don't think there's a timetable for leaders in Beijing to use force against Taiwan.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Simona, do you want to weigh in on these issues?
Sure, especially the identity question. Maybe I'm going to try to break it down into 4 points. First of all, I think that there is one intergenerational issues. I mean, the older generations of people that came over with Chiang Kai-shek have been dying out for a while, and their kids and their grandkids have their roots in Taiwan, right? That makes a big difference, of course, for the orientation of the newer generation. The second point, of course, that China has becoming much more, this is the point you just made, much more aggressive in the past few years. And also China has been, since at least 2016, we have heard it before also with Marc's presentation, pushing and isolating Taiwan in the international sphere. And that means it also has been hollowing out the China brand name or monopolizing it for itself. So of course, this has led to a shift in Taiwanese people's understanding that nobody recognizes them as China, right, nowadays. So of course, this also has an impact on them. And the last point, I would say, I can't read my handwriting. Yeah, a very important point, is that Taiwanese people know very well what it means to be living under an authoritarian regime. And now I'm not talking about the China outside, on the other side of the strait, but the China inside. 87 is not that long ago. Well, most of us, probably not the students, but most of us were here and were already grown-ups, right? So 87 actually is very fresh in the mind of many older or not so older generation Taiwanese that remember what it meant not to be able to speak freely, not to be able to express their mind, their views. They remember what it means to be living under a regime that sanctions all of that, and they don't want to go back to that. And the fourth point is the fact that now it is finally possible to do what wasn't possible to do during, of course, the Kuomintang time, when, of course, a sort of high culture was imposed on them, and they were led to believe that they were Chinese, that they were the true China. All that they did in the arts, in the literature sphere was about China. All that they learned was about China. But Taiwan has been separated from China basically forever, except for 4 years in which they were under the Kuomintang regime united, and before that loosely controlled as a sub-province of Fujian province in the Qing dynasty. This means the two places have developed completely in a very different sphere. They have had different social and political and economic experiences. And of course, these have had an impact on younger generation, and also older generation of Taiwanese that now reflect on themselves and think, why isn't it possible to think about ourselves as just Taiwanese? There's a brilliant book, by the way, I would recommend, Orphan of Asia, that really talks about, was written, I think, in the 60s in Japanese, or maybe end of the 50s, and talks about this dilemma of many Taiwanese being caught between China, Japan, and simply Taiwan.
Excellent, thanks. I will remember those 4 points. Very, very nice. Marc, so you've got a question on the table here that's sort of my own. You sparked many questions, but this one in particular is one that I'd like you to elaborate on a little bit about this notion of decline or strength of the West, and how you weigh on that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Chinese officials have been claiming for years that the US and more broadly the West is declining, and it's the natural trend of history that China will at some point reach the first position in as a world power. I have to say that I don't know to what extent they fully believe in that, because the US is still quite powerful right now and in the years to come. As a matter of fact, and China cannot not seeing that. The US and allies are redefining their strategies and doctrine towards the Indo-Pacific. We have discussed that in the previous panel, but for example, the Quad mechanism, the Quad plus something mechanism, now AUKUS, and the Indo-Pacific strategies now, like pretty much every country has its own Indo-Pacific strategy. First of all, the US, but also even in Europe, France, the EU, Netherlands, Germany. So I think there is something here, and it's difficult, I have to admit, to understand how the Chinese strategists and Chinese officials see this kind of reshaping of the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Certainly, they would not see those changes as a good sign, as an opportunity for them, and so that's why. Clearly, the US is rebalancing. Taiwan is trying to get more and more autonomous and to expand its armed force capabilities. Japan as well. Australia is wanting to have nuclear-powered submarines. So, in some times from now, in the coming decades, the balance of power is going to evolve. It's not really clear to what extent and how, but this could somehow raise some concerns in Beijing, and so that's why in the 3 points I shared, which are not forecast. It's not trying to focus the future, but just open question on how to anticipate what is difficult to anticipate, or thinking the unthinkable, as Dr. Loh said. So that's why, yeah, I think that it's worth asking the question of, for China, when is the best time, if the PRC is serious about taking Taiwan by force, when is the best time? And everybody seems to agree that it will be after 2027, it will be most likely even after 2030. And I agree on that, because I agree that China still lacks really important capabilities to launch such a military operation. But I would be even more cautious and to plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Great, thank you. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. I think that's a good advice. And you also mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategies, and Europe is one actor, of course, in that mosaic. And I'll put a little plug for our last session, so you can remember to stick with us, where our colleague Céline Pajon will be leading a discussion with the head of policy planning in the EU's External Action Service about the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. So please stick with us for that. Let's now turn to the floor for questions or comments, analysis. You're also allowed to give your point of view, not only raise questions. So if there are any, yes, Eric.
I'm Eric Weibach with the German Institute for International Security Affairs in Berlin. I think we heard a lot about the changing attitudes towards Taiwan, especially in Europe, and some excellent remarks by Professor GRANO. So I wonder, very simple question maybe to both Professor GRANO and Dr. Loh, what comes next within the constraints of European still active one China policy, but also a changing attitude, a more critical attitude towards China? What can Europe do within the constraints of this one China policy for moving its relations with Taiwan forward? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I think we'll pick that straight up. So Simona, maybe I'll turn to you, and then we'll let Dr. Loh pick that up as well. The what next, and maybe Dr. Loh also, what you expect, or what would you like to see from European partners?
Right, thank you. It's actually an excellent question to which I probably will not have an excellent answer. I think it's very complicated, specifically at the level of European, because we have so many different interests and so many countries that don't agree with each other. And even when you take Switzerland, which, as I said, is not technically in the EU, of course, but still has its own China interest, we see how much the weight of the economic ties actually plays a role in this, right? And that will be much worse than what we have now with the Russian-Ukraine situation, because most of us, specifically Switzerland, I can say for sure, but I would say all the other countries are much more enmeshed in economic ties with China than we are with Russia, and that would mean, except of course maybe for the gas and oil question, but that would mean of course that we would all suffer and take much more of a brunt if we were to implement sanction, if China were to invade Taiwan. But I think what is going on is maybe not so much what we can do. I think what we are doing actually the right things, starting a discussion. The point is, will we implement, for example, the kind of things that have been said last week in the case of, the European Parliament? Will they really follow through and not just say there should be consequences for what China has done after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the blockade, the military aggression? That should have an impact on the EU-ONS relationship. What does it mean, right? I think so. We are setting up, that's what I hear at least, I'm not in any governments of course, but contingency plans, and also looking into ways to decouple for however it is possible, and in whichever sectors it will really be possible. It's not possible in all of them. So I think that is a very complicated question, but what we can do maybe, and what we don't do enough, just to give some concrete reply to your answer, is that I don't think we use enough verbal deterrence. We are very often very cautious not to offend China. This is certainly the case in Switzerland, where we always tiptoe around anything that might be potentially construed as being anti-China, anti-government. But on the other hand, how often have we wondered what if we had raised the cost before, even with Russia? Maybe it would have happened the same, but I think that's the only thing that we can do, signal to China that, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are united, we won't just stand by if they invade Taiwan. There will be consequences, and the consequences will make China suffer very much, and us as well. And that's something that we don't do enough. We don't communicate it clearly to China.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for that, those remarks. Dr. Ruo, maybe you'd like to respond to that, and I think in some ways maybe I'll even add on to the question a little bit to go back to your second of three sources that you talked about, and the feeling of insecurity of authoritarian leaders. And I guess that also sort of begs the question of to what extent is the European response, in particular, I guess it's more relevant to the American response because they're much more militarily engaged. You need to find some sort of balance of deterrence, but not threat necessarily, because as soon as, based on I guess my interpretation, and again, so please correct me if I'm wrong, this feeling of insecurity on authoritarian regimes, if they read deterrence and strong language and strong pressures as threats, then that might actually increase their need to act and become more aggressive. So why don't you weigh in on this, please, Dr. Luo?
When it comes to Taiwan-EU relations, I think China opposes any improvement of relations between Taiwan and European countries. That's a factor there. So we have to think and act out of the box. In other words, we should not think before China react. For many countries, they will think that, well, if I do this and do that with Taiwan, and China will retaliate and respond and so on. So, you have this kind of self-censorship in terms of how to improve ties between European countries and Taiwan. And so we have to think and do out of the box. So if that's the case, then there are all kinds of possibilities for cooperation between Taiwan and European countries. Economic cooperation, political communication cooperation, or even military cooperation. Let me give you an example. When you talk about military cooperation, it's not just about arms sales. It's not just about, this kind of joint military exercises. There are all kinds of ways that we can cooperate militarily in terms of a more creative sense. For instance, cyber attack. Cyber attack has been one of the areas that Taiwan has been facing every day. So in terms of cyber cooperation between European countries and Taiwan, I think that is very important. For another example, influence operation by authoritarian countries on democracies. China has been using our democracy, using our transparency to influence Taiwan's domestic politics. So all democracies, including Taiwan and European countries, can also cooperate on that front. How to deal with this kind of outside influence operation. So there are all kinds of possible areas of future cooperation between Taiwan and European countries. So if there's a will, there's a way. So let's think about that. And I think we can come up with a whole list of areas that we can cooperate. But when it comes to this kind of insecurity, yes, these are things that are beyond our control. But there are things that we can control. That is, we should increase our deterrence to deter China from taking any reckless military actions against Taiwan. So we have to make leaders in Beijing believe that if they wake up in the morning, they will think twice and think that today is not a day because Taiwan is well prepared and Taiwan will have the support from other countries to come to its assistance. So what happens within China, inside China, is beyond, in many cases, is beyond our control. So what we can do is to beef up our defense capabilities. We are not just talking about defense. Deterrence is the key because we have to prevent war from happening. Okay, even if China feels so insecure, but if we have the power and capability to deter China, to make China think that they will pay a highly cost for invading Taiwan and they will not get away with it, then China will, think twice, even if they feel so insecure. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. David, I'll go, then I'll come to you next. David, I know you had a question, so go ahead.
A question to Professor Lo. We've seen in the last few days an outpouring of grief in Hong Kong in front of the British consulate. To what extent has the efforts by the Chinese to shoot themselves in the foot to show that the one China, the one country, two systems policy was at best nonsense and at worst a lie, to what extent has that changed Taiwanese views of unification and independence? And my second point is a caveat. I mean, we're concerned with the Taiwan Straits, but when you're in relation to China, but when you're in Phnom Penh and Vientiane, what worries you about China is becoming a vassal state. What worries you about China is the dam building on the Mekong, which threatens the livelihood of some 20 million people. It's just a way of sort of relativizing, because the Taiwan issue is dividing ASEAN. There is a clear gulf, perhaps Shafi could confirm this, between the continental countries of Southeast Asia and the maritime Southeast Asia, who do have issues with China over territorial issues in the South China Sea. So, but just in the sense to relativize, we're very concerned about Northeast Asia, but I'm always concerned that Southeast Asia seems to sort of, we sort of wiped off the map, so to speak, and these are really serious geopolitical issues.
Great, thank you for your question. Thank you for reminding us that Southeast Asia is indeed on the map, and so we here at Ifri, we do like to try to remind ourselves of that very often and include that also in our own approach. Dr. Luo, perhaps you want to take that question.
And the question about Hong Kong, I think the Hong Kong issue is very important for Taiwan because China has been trying to sell the so-called one country, two system model to Taiwan by implementing it first to Hong Kong. But what happened in Hong Kong, told the people in Taiwan that the so-called one country, two system formula is not working. The model is not working. So, but China has been very rigid, even until now, after 30 years, still insists that that's the only formula or only model that will be applied to resolve the division between the two sides of Taiwan Strait. So that kind of rigidity, has again alienated people in Taiwan. But what's worse is that China did not keep Hong Kong intact for 50 years. That's what they preached. Now they are tightening up their control in Hong Kong. And I have to say that in year 2020, when we had an election, what happened in Hong Kong in 2019 creates some sort of repercussion within Taiwan. And that, to some extent, led to the victory of the DPP in the national election, in the presidential election in 2020. So, as you said, China shot its own foot, but that's what happened because China has more concern about its own domestic problems. And Hong Kong is no longer that important, in terms of financial, in terms of economic position or role of Hong Kong. So, China is ruining Hong Kong. and it's also ruining the dreams for some people in Taiwan about this kind of reunification with China and also one country, two system model. And on the so-called ASEAN country, and I have to say that it's an action-reaction process between China's relations with ASEAN countries. And China's approach has been a divide and defeat approach, divide and conquer approach. You know, when you have a unified ASEAN vis-a-vis China, and I think you are having a very strong bargaining position. But in some cases, every individual ASEAN countries is also thinking about a better relationship with China in terms of economic cooperation and so on. So China used this kind of divide and defeat to try to, you know, to divide ASEAN countries in order to prevent that kind of unified position vis-a-vis China. But another factor that affects ASEAN's policy toward China, to me, is that U.S. policy or U.S. Indo-Pacific policy is very important. All the Asian countries know the history of East Asia. That is, China had been, for 1,000 years, had been the so-called dominant power in the region. What China really wanted by creating this so-called China Dream is to recreate this kind of tributary system in Asia. China expanding its power and so on. So some countries, or I would say a lot of countries, are hoping that could be a balancing power to, you know, to redress the imbalance. So if the U.S. is willing to take that kind of challenge to become the power to balance China's rising power, then I think a lot of people will be joining the U.S. to balance China's rising. But on the other hand, if the U.S. is not willing to take that kind of role, I'm afraid this kind of bandwagoning effect will be taking place. In other words, some countries will be jumped onto China's bandwagoning, and you know, if that's the case, then China's influence in the region will be expanding. So it's a very dynamic situation. China's approach in the region, the U.S. policy towards East Asia, are also very important in terms of deciding the future of China-U.S., China-ASEAN relationship.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. Dr. Luo, I don't know if you wanted to add on to that at all.
Maybe very briefly, in 2019, when Xi Jinping gave a speech as a New Year commemoration in January, that was actually a commemoration for a series of epistolary exchanges that started in the 50s towards China, or rather not towards from China towards Taiwan, to entice Taiwanese compatriots to reunify with the motherland. And in that speech in 2019, he actually talked about that. It was a commemoration of another speech that Deng Xiaoping gave in '79. And he used, of course, this equation, right? The one country, two system formula for Taiwan. And he also talked about Taiwanese people being, in a sort of passive-aggressive way, the ones that are at fault for holding China back from achieving the dream of national reunification, of course, and rejuvenation in this China dream of his, right? But I think after that, of course, you had a lot of commentators wondering whether maybe the formula was the problem. And I think this is absolutely erroneous mindset that we have, because no matter what the formula is, as Dr. Luo just explained, especially after what the Taiwanese have seen has happened in the case of the breaking of all promises and also joint declarations that, of course, went on with Hong Kong, any other formula that could be proposed, you know, would not be sold to the Taiwanese at all.
Great, thank you. Very good points. We've got about 5 minutes, and for those of you who are online, I would like to announce to you that you do have a voice in the room, and I'm going to hand you that voice right now in the person of Céline Pajon this time around. But please remember that for the future discussions, you have a voice who can voice your question. So okay. Céline, go ahead.
Thanks, John. Yes, I would like to relay one quick question and one very tricky question, actually, from the online audience, because we spent 90 minutes saying that it is actually very difficult to provide any foresight and a very precise idea about the imminence or not of the conflict in the Taiwan Strait. But I have here a question from somebody who is in the chip industry and who would like to have a number on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 being no war in the Taiwan Strait for the next 5 years, and 10 being, yeah, I'm sure there will be a war in the next 5 years. What would be your number? Thank you.
Number, okay. Let's let me have you think about the number, and then perhaps we can conclude with that. In the meantime, I'll take one more question, and then you can answer that question and give your number. So, Dr. Li, yes, I would like to.
Thank you very much for very interesting discussions. My name is Sang-Soo Lee. I'm working at the Institute for Security and Development Policy based in Stockholm. I'm more interested in Europeans' feeling about the Russia threat and Chinese threat. If there is any differences, different feeling about those two different threats, because I think due to historical and geographical reasons, of course, there is also different sympathy about Ukraine and Taiwan. How this different feeling could react if military conflict will take place in the Taiwan Strait. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I know, Mr. Long, you also had a question. I'll let you add on that. And then we'll go on.
It's a brief question for Dr. Loh. It's about what happened in August, the military exercises of China. Some of the exercise zones were having a footprint inside the territorial waters of Taiwan. What is the response you have on this issue? And it could be very important for the future, of course. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll finish off with you, Dr. Loh. We're going to go in reverse order. So Simona, Marc, and then you, Dr. Zhang. So Simona, go ahead.
All right, so maybe I'll just try to address your question. I think I'll just give you an example of my own experience. I'm editing a volume on the China-US competition and the impact on small and middle countries in Europe and Asia. In the first edition that was of the chapters, was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, most of the European countries talked about economic concerns. So how to better balance their values and their economic concerns without irritating China too much, but it was not so much of a talk about security concerns, right? Whereas, of course, countries in Asia already had that in the back of their minds because of what you mentioned, the proximity, geographical proximity. In the second edition of the chapters that was sent to us over the summer after the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, actually you see a lot of increase in security concerns, because I think this goes back to the issue of what we discussed before. Even though you're completely right, we have different perspectives, as it should be, because Russia and China are different. Nevertheless, I think there's a translation or an equation in our minds that autocracies in general work the same way. And if, of course, Russia has invaded Ukraine, what stands in the way of China invading Taiwan? So I think in a very bad analogy, I would say that the only positive thing that comes out of this heightened geopolitical situation is really the internationalization of the Taiwan issue, which was not on everybody's lips until a few years ago, and now it is.
Right, thank you. Did you want to weigh in on a number? You don't have to.
No, I don't. I think that's like crystal ball prediction are not my.
You're not a numbers person. Okay, that's fine. You don't. I'm not gonna press you and make you do that. So go ahead, Marc.
On the Russia-China threat, so obviously Russia is more an immediate, geographically speaking, an immediate threat to Europe, and China is much far away. However, there is one common point between China and Russia, is that there are two authoritarian countries and with expansionist ambitions. And I think that the war in Ukraine reminds us all in Europe that China may represent a threat in terms of economic competition, but also it is also a power with territorial ambitions, whether it be in the South China Sea, we know that for years, but also with Taiwan and all. So I think that's why also when the war broke out in February this year, many people would wonder if it would have an impact on our European Indo-Pacific strategies. And as a matter of fact, and we will discuss that later on this afternoon, it doesn't seem to have had huge consequences on our Indo-Pacific strategy, because Ukraine is kind of an evidence that we have to be more careful and to protect perhaps a bit better and tighter our territories, our interest in the Indo-Pacific, because of partly because of China's territorial ambitions. So yeah, that's why China, after the war in Ukraine, China has raised as a strategic priority, perhaps in the European strategic thinking.
Great, thank you, Marc. And numbers? No, you don't have to either, but. Take a risk.
It's risky.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Numbers are always a tricky game, so we don't want to get caught. But that is an interesting, thought-provoking question that actually would require a 30-page paper of analysis to back up your numbers. So that justifies the reticence. Dr. Luo, let's finish up with you, and then we'll let you go to dinner, and we'll all break for lunch. So please go ahead.
I'll join you for lunch. Well. On the response of Taiwan to the recent military drills by China in August, I think whenever there are military exercises conducted by China, we have another opportunity to test and to practice our strategies in responding possible scenarios that could happen in the Taiwan Strait. So we seize upon this opportunity to practice, to test our military. But this is a new situation because they launched missiles in the eastern coast of Taiwan. So we had to change our rule of engagement and so on. So we do have some modifications of our rules of engagement. In addition to that, obviously, China tried to show that they have this kind of A2AD, anti-access area denial capabilities. So it's very important for us to develop this kind of counter A2AD capabilities. So that's one of the areas that we had to speed up in terms of acquiring weaponries and changing our strategies and tactics and so on. So we also learning from the recent drills from the PRC. But the thing we have concern about is whether this kind of military drills could become a new normal. In other words, there will be similar regular exercises and so on, and that would be a challenge for Taiwan. Okay, and the responses would be different. If that's an isolated case, then we have a certain response. But if that becomes the normal practices or normal exercises, and it happens every week or every month, then our response would be very different. And finally, in terms of the numbers, I have to say that we have to make sure the number is zero.
There you go.
That's
all right. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for playing the numbers game. And I wish you a bon appetit for dinner, and we'll all break for lunch. And please join me in thanking all of our panelists, our speakers.